Hello, everyone. Welcome
Hi.
back to the AAS YouTube channel. And this is part of the good stuff. This is the AAS Journal Author Series. And I'm very happy to have Brian Lacki with us today. Hi, Brian.
Hi, Frank. Yeah.
Where are you
How are you
located?
doing? Oh, hi.
Where are you located at, Brian?
Right now I'm in my home in New Jersey. So, yeah, that's generally where I actually spend most of my time. And, so.
Is there, let's see, we are January 13th, 2022, as we do this recording. Is there snow on the ground in Jersey there?
There was, but there's been some rain that melted most of it. So,
okay.
Yeah, great.
Okay, cool. And you have I thought from the paper that you were at Berkeley, or at least you have
I definitely work for them. We have sort of an arrangement where I work remotely most of the time. Normally I would be visiting them, but because of the pandemic and various issues, who knows when that will be, but
okay.
But we keep in touch through Slack and Zoom meetings. So
cool. Good. And that's an awesome background picture you got. What galaxy is that?
Oh, it's NGC 7331. It's a spiral galaxy in Pegasus. As a little confession, it's not actually part of the Exotica Catalog, but it's okay. So it's just sort of my default background.
Very cool. Very cool. So Brian, what do you like to do for research?
Well, these days I mostly do SETI research, and that's a very general category. The Exotica Catalog itself has consumed a lot of my time over the past couple of years, but also things like new technosignatures, and I'm working on a paper regarding sort of populations and statistics, and also galactic scale things, because my PhD thesis work and my initial postdoc, I was more of a galaxy person, studying cosmic rays and gamma rays and radio waves.
Cool.
So, yeah.
Yes, I handle quite a few of those manuscripts.
Yeah.
Very cool. And that is going to bring us to this very lovely APJ supplement article.
Yeah.
One of everything. The Breakthrough Listen Exotica Catalog. And Brian, take us away.
Hi. So I'd like to thank my co-authors here, part of Breakthrough Listen, who have both helped with the paper and also will be helping with observing these objects in the coming months and years, I hope. And of course, I'd like to thank the Breakthrough Prize Foundation for funding this. So the Exotica Catalog, it's been, when we think of SETI, sort of the classical SETI observational program has been to observe nearby sun-like stars. And more powerful SETI surveys just typically involve observing more stars, or perhaps getting more sensitivity for these nearby stars. But you also have these, but SETI is now, in its modern form, is about 60 years old, and we still haven't found the technosignature besides our own, of course. So you have this criticism from outside the field and inside the field of, well, what if we're not looking in the right place? What if we're not using the right strategy? What if the evidence for extraterrestrial intelligence is out there and in fact staring us in the face, but we're just looking in the wrong direction, because we're basically focused on this anthropocentric mindset that ET will be like us, that they'll live on Earth-like planets around G-dwarf stars, in the outer edges in the disks of spiral galaxies. So yes, from the beginning, Breakthrough Listen has been although it will be observing lots and lots of stars, it will also, there's also been this discussion within the group of what else could we be observing. And even on our original target paper, Isaacson 2017, describing, basically listing the nearby stars and galaxies we'll be looking at, there was this small note on we intend to look at exotica, things like Pluto or quasars or pulsars, things that you normally don't look at in SETI.
Mhm.
These are things that are exotic from a SETI context, even if they're sort of bread and butter nowadays in the astronomy context. Like the quasar, like most people would say, oh, quasars, they're filled with radiation, and you have these and they're just so far away, you're never going to see anything that's artificial there. But what if we're wrong? What if they're,
Right.
you know, so, and there's been some, so sort of the Exotica Catalog, this notion of one of everything is sort of our attempt to really sort of cover all bases, at least that we know of. Get every, so, and that in a sense that includes things that aren't just interesting, like, or spectacular or high energy, but even relatively mundane things like asteroids, comets, brown dwarfs, or at least mundane from sort of, you know, from maybe from a public standpoint. I mean, I'm sure people who study them, they're very interesting. And so there's been some historical precedent for looking in these unexpected places for new phenomena. Perhaps the sort of the most relevant type, most relevant example in SETI, well, if you know the Drake equation, one of the, you have these different terms for, does a star have planets? Does it have, do those planets have life? Do they have intelligence? And so on.
Yep.
Well, for several decades, we didn't even know if stars beyond our own really had planets. Even as there was, even in the early part of the 20th century, it wasn't clear that planets were at all common. And in the 1950s, Otto Struve wrote this paper suggesting, well, maybe we could look for planets like Jupiter that are very close to their host star. The thing, the idea being that with the capabilities of the time in the 1950s and throughout much of the 20th century, we basically had no hope of detecting a planet like Jupiter or Earth, a small planet close to the star or a large planet far from the star. But if there was a planet very close to its star that was also big, then you would, both the spectroscopic radial velocity signatures and the transit signatures, those would be relatively big, and you might have a chance of detecting them even with sort of mid-20th century technology. But even though that was suggested in the 50s, it wasn't really acted upon because people were just kept looking for things like Jupiter or that were far away from their host stars. And it would just be too hard to detect those things. So, and then as it turns out, in the 1990s, you suddenly discover 51 Pegasi B, and it turns out that's like a Jupiter-sized planet orbiting very close to its host star. So we might have, and so you might have actually found these planets sort of a couple decades early if we had just looked, or at least made a serious attempt to look. And there's been sort of some historical studies, especially by, for example, Martin Harwood, where they often suggest that when you're trying to discover something new, it's often unexpected, and it results from observing in new ways, in different. It's serendipitous, basically. So, for example, I mean, fast radio bursts a recent hot topic, and that we that was sort of a serendipitous discovery in the archives of a pulsar survey. So so you might, so sort of the Exotica Catalog, the idea is we sort of try to increase serendipity by looking at as wide a diversity of targets as possible. And the idea is to, I mean, we haven't detected ETI yet, and there's this controversy of, does that mean anything? There's something called the Fermi Paradox, where you might expect ETIs to sort of populate an entire galaxy, and you would expect them to be in our solar system and so on. And that's a very controversial argument. I think most SETI researchers have their own opinion one way or the other. But that does raise the question of, well, what if they're not like us? What if we're looking in the wrong places? And like, so like, what if they are in the solar system, but like in the Kuiper belt or something? What if they like neutron stars? Or what if they even live on neutron stars, like in a science fiction novel? I mean, you can't exactly build a rocket ship to go off a neutron star. So, so the idea is sort of to broaden our and hopefully that will sort of manufacture the serendipitous factor. And
yes,
yeah, at least, and well, I mean, we kind of hope to discover ETI, but maybe we could discover something else that would also, just as these other surveys do.
Fair enough.
So
cool.
So if you go to figure 1, please.
Figure 1, Exotica Catalog. Here we go. Let's blow that up a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is a sort of sketch of how target selection might go in a SETI survey. So we just sort of present this concept that there are sort of 3 different ways or dimensions that you could go about, and this is with about target selection. There are plenty of additional dimensions on what you do with each target. But the idea is basically, well, one strategy would be to spend time basically spend a lot of your time observing a single target or a few targets, and that's sort of depth. Another is to spend a lot of time observing a lot of targets of a similar type, but maybe less time on each individual target, and we call that count. And the third is sort of breadth, which is the diversity of types of targets you're looking at. So different SETI surveys, different surveys in general, they focus sort of on different dimensions because you have a finite amount of time and resources to invest. So you can't. So, but they sort of probe along different dimensions of this plot. So the sort of the classical strategy is to invest in SETI, is to invest in what we call count, the number of stars that we're looking at. And so basically, if we knew that ETIs were very, very common, they were around every star, and then you would probably just want to focus on, say, a few stars and observe them very, very well, because maybe they're just too faint to observe. Even with our own, even with Breakthrough Listen, it would be hard to detect the Earth unless you around, say, a star that was 10 parsecs away. So in that case, if we were certain that these societies were very common, you would want to focus on basically get a high quality observations of a few stars, and that's depth. we don't know how common extraterrestrial intelligences are, but the standing idea has been that they're around sun-like stars. In that case, if we suspect that they're rare, but that we know what kinds of objects host them, then you want to focus on count, because that increases the probability that you'll basically intercept one of these rare phenomena.
Right.
And so an example of that will be our million star survey with a meerkat. We'll be looking, we'll only be spending a few minutes with a commensal beam on each star, but it'll be a large number of them.
Right.
And
very nice.
So the Exotica Catalog sort of has been meant to cover this sort of final dimension of breadth. Most SETI surveys in particular, they have focused on stars, but there are so many different types of astrophysical phenomena that are out there, and maybe one of those hosts a different kind of non-human-like intelligence.
Right.
So now, because of the finite amount of time we have, it's just sort of one of every type that we'll be observing at least to start. So that's sort of the name of the paper, one of everything, which means that you aren't going to be observing lots and lots of anything, but the idea. So, I mean, if ETIs say are not only rare, but and they only appear around some weird phenomena and they're very faint, we're not going to be able to find them because of the finite time we have. But
right,
we're sort of expanding throughout this parameter space, and the Exotica Catalog sort of fills one of the sort of easy gaps of high breadth but low count and depth.
Good. Good. I'm with
you. So if we keep going to I believe figure 2 actually would be good.
Figure 2. Okay, let's blow that up a little bit. There we go.
Okay.
Properties.
Yeah. So the Exotica Catalog, when we say one of everything, and then that leads to the question of what is a thing? How do you divide that up? Like we could just say, oh, we have a star, we have a planet, we have a galaxy, we have a nebula, and we looked at those 4 things there. We got one of everything. So it's a matter of how fine-grained you want to go and
what's a thing.
But one way to think of it is that if you plot the properties of astrophysical objects on a graph like this, they tend to fall in clusters or clouds or sequences. And the sort of archetypal example of that is the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram.
Indeed.
Most stars fall on the main sequence. And then you have these sort of clusters for red giants and white dwarfs. So, and sort of we have different samples in the Exotica Catalog, and those sort of correspond to different relationships to these sort of clouds or clusters. So the first thing you might look at is, well, you want a typical example of an object, of each type of object. Those would be things that sort of lie in the centers of these clouds, like say P4 on that plot. So those are sort of the prototypes. They're sort of archetypes. They're typical, what we think are typical examples, generally well studied, of each type of phenomena. Now, in some cases, the phenomenon might be very diverse, like the main sequence spans a huge range in stellar temperature and luminosity. So you might divide sort of the sequence into several bins and have a prototype for each of them. Like you might have a prototype for, say, early O-type stars, late O-type stars, all the way through M dwarfs, L dwarfs, and so on. The next, but what if ETIs are sort of biased and they're rare because that they they typically lie on, because only certain extreme circumstances leads to the development or of either extraterrestrial intelligence or of the technologies that allow one to communicate, like maybe extraterrestrial intelligence are common, but only ones that have a very bright star are able to build, say, a structure that has enough power to broadcast to the entire galaxy.
Got it.
So the idea there is, so that's sort of the idea of the sort of a second sample, the superlative sample. And if you see those ringed objects with the S label, those correspond to things that are sort of at the edges of these clouds. In some cases, they might just be sort of on the edge, like S1. In another case, they might be actually, it might turn out that they actually belong to a different population, like S2. In some cases, it may turn out that the superlatives that we know of, they're actually not atypical. It's just that our capabilities are limited and we aren't able to detect things that are more extreme. Like, for example, neutron stars. We have examples of old neutron stars within our superlative sample, the cold neutron stars and so on. It's thought that most of those are around 100 million years old. Those are very old compared to a lot of the non-unrecycled radio pulsars that we discover. But it's thought that there are really old neutron stars out there that are like 10 billion years old. And one of those could be very near, relatively speaking. Like we think the nearest neutron star is like actually around 10 parsecs away. But it's just so cold and so faint that we have no hope of ever detecting it with current technology. So in that case, you have this sort of bias. But if ETIs are sort of biased, going to these superlatives would sort of provide the best chance of finding them, because, like, for the neutron star example, maybe young neutron stars are just, they have too much radiation to really host anything interesting.
Okay.
The third sample is the anomaly sample. In some cases, an anomaly might represent a new population that we haven't discovered yet. Like the Lorimer burst, for a few years, it was the only thing of its time that we knew of until we discovered more of them. It was an anomaly. We didn't really know what it represented. In a few cases, it's possible that the anomalies actually represent something unique.
Okay.
And, so they would sort of form a class unto themselves. And that would, of course, be very interesting in its own right.
Indeed.
And finally, there's sort of a fourth sample we include for completeness, which is a control sample. Those are objects which are either very mundane, but were thought of as special, or in some cases, they turned out not to even exist, like errors in catalogs and that sort of thing. There are just a few of those. The idea is that they would sort of serve as dress rehearsals, in a way. We would sort of analyze them as if there was something there. And if we find something, that could be a sign that there's something wrong with our analysis. So these all sort of tie into the basic motivations for the Exotica Catalog. But there's the first motivation being that maybe extraterrestrial intelligences live in some place that's beyond the normal assumption of around sun-like stars on Earth-like planets. The second, which is sort of really out there, but it's been a sort of a thread since back in the 60s. Maybe a few of these objects, at least, particularly the anomalies, maybe they actually are artificial in and of themselves. And that sort of goes back to Kardashev
Okay.
1960s.
Mhm.
He pointed out this sort of a gigahertz peaking quasar, CTA 102, and suggested that it was artificial. Now, nowadays, we know that it's natural, and we expect that to be true of pretty much everything. But, you know, just for completeness, you know,
Yep.
so that sort of especially motivates these anomalies. The third is that you might have false positives from natural things that happen to look like artificial signals, like pulsars. Jocelyn Bell Burnell sort of jokingly called them little green men when she discovered them. And if we ever do make a detection that seems to look artificial, there's going to be lots and lots of controversy. So we want to sort of be on the lookout for anything that could sort of masquerade as artificial. And the fourth is that in SETI, there's this notion of commensal study where we sort of process observations made for other purposes using SETI technology, like while we're looking, and this another motivation. So this motivation would be sort of to reverse that and do commensal astrophysics. So these observations, even though they're mostly meant for SETI, you could do sort of conventional astronomy with them, especially with some of these. With our instruments in particular, we have the ability to sort of channelize whole gigahertz worth of the spectrum, and that's of the radio spectrum. You have these sort of unique capabilities, and you might find something interesting natural if we look at these natural objects.
Okay.
And the fifth is sort of to manage these systematics, to look at things with the control sample. You look at things that you don't expect to see anything, and see if anything pops up, because that could be a sign of a problem.
Right.
Okay, so so if we move on to the prototype sample next section.
Sure. Prototype, a treasury survey.
Yeah, so that's sort of, the prototypes are sort of the heart of the catalog. We sort of classify them into these different phyla. That's sort of a different main types of objects, and then we look, and then there are a bunch of subtypes within each phylum. So the idea is that each object in the prototype survey, it's supposed to represent something prototypical, something standard of each for each type of object. And finding a prototype for each, there have been, in the literature, there's been some attempts to sort of basically come up with a list of every type of object, at least on a broad scale. Even Martin Harwood's book, he's done some classification. Stephen J. Dick, a NASA historian, has come up with a classification system. He uses kingdoms, so we use phyla because they're more fine-grained. But in general, there are classification systems, like if you look at, say, SIMBAD, the astrophysical object database, it lists different types of objects. But what you don't typically find is a list of an example of each type of object. They typically list that these objects exist, but maybe don't provide, say, a close by, well-studied example or prototype. For example, can you name a Lyman alpha emitter off the top of your head?
A Lyman alpha emitter?
Yeah, and an individual Lyman alpha emitter.
No.
Okay. How about an ultra compact X-ray binary?
No.
An E-type asteroid?
Yeah. I can do a few of those. So I could do asteroids.
Okay, but most astronomers probably could probably do this for their own subfield, but
Sure.
not
Sure.
for every type of object.
Fair enough.
So we
just had a great example of that.
Yeah. So basically, a lot of the effort in this catalog has been combing through the literature, trying to find these individual objects to put in this prototype sample. Now, in some cases, these are made relatively easy because there are actual standard objects. There are spectral standard stars for the different classes of stars. Sometimes you run into issues with slightly different classifications, like with different galaxy morphologies. Maybe one source classifies a galaxy as SB and another SA or something like that. But we generally look for things that were fairly stable in terms of classification. In other cases, if you look through review papers or papers in general, you might find that they actually say the prototypical object, whatever, and then you could use that. Like back when I was mainly doing galaxies, I'd often run across papers, and sometimes I wrote them saying the prototypical starburst galaxy M82, and so that sort of goes in the catalog. So they actually, as you can see on the sort of the left column of the paper prototype archetype, you look, so, and you look at review papers, and you sort of, in other cases, there might be catalogs of objects, and then you look for, one thing we did was Simbad has a feature where you can sort of cite the citations to where you can list sort of the objects in a catalog and then sort them by number of citations. So then we would look at look for objects with a high number of citations. You might run into a bit of trouble because sometimes a thing is highly cited because it's unusual, but we try to and other cases you have things like variable stars where the class of variable stars is named after the prototype itself, and there's a few obvious ones like that. In a few cases with certain types of high redshift galaxies, I mean, those are kind of anonymous in a sense, like submillimeter galaxies, which are mainly found at like redshift 2. Those are sort of studied in bulk. So one thing we looked for were these galaxies with gravitational lensing. So that sort of boosts our sensitivity. And so that's one thing we did.
Okay.
So that's sort of the prototype sample. One issue with the prototype sample is that you often have sort of overlapping systems of classification. Like if you look at asteroids, you can classify them by spectral type, you can classify them by orbit. And so you can have things that, so you have these sort of overlapping classes. And now we do say one of everything. There are a few things that are relatively impractical to observe. One of those are transient objects, like a fast radio burst. Now, in some cases, you can look for the fast, like in some cases, these things are, say, periodic or predictable, or we know of an object that hosts these transients. But in another case, you're not going to be able to know beforehand. So the best we could probably do is to look at the known host of these transients, or failing that, we could hope to, we might detect these things if through things like the astronomer's telegram. Maybe that can provide an alert system. So although we say one of everything, there are some things that are hard to include. You know, and conversely, for a few objects, they're just so big on the sky that you can't really say that you can't really practically observe them. You could potentially put in something like say the hot interstellar medium, but that covers like the entire galactic disk. So you know, so it's just too diffuse, or dark matter, or halos, or what have you. So the second sample is the superlative sample, and again, that involved a literature search. You basically look through these. Sometimes you have papers that directly announce, say, the hottest planet, the brightest galaxy, the biggest black hole, the smallest black hole, even in their title. And those provide sort of relatively easy superlatives. Of course, one issue you have is that there are lots and lots of different properties of each type of object. You can have basically dozens of different quantities that you can measure for each type of object, and conceivably you could have a superlative for each of them. That would be very quickly impractical, even if we focus on sort of broad classes. Like if we had, say, the brightest B absolute magnitude, brightest V absolute magnitude, all the way through the entire filter system, you know, that wouldn't be practical. So we mainly focus on very broad, very basic fundamental parameters, mass, size, luminosity, for these age, in some cases. In a few cases, like neutron stars, there's a basic property like spin period or magnetic field that we consider. But those basic fundamental quantities, we look for, in our literature search, we look for objects that sort of fit into those, that have the most extreme values, either because they say they do, or because they're noted to have relatively extreme values, and we couldn't find anything that's relatively brighter or relatively more extreme. So an example, as you where your mouse is, one of them is the star R136A1. Is in the Large Magellanic Cloud in 30 Doradus. It is probably one of the most massive stars we know of, with around 200, 300 solar masses. It's possible we observe stars that are a bit beyond that, but reliably, we know that R136A1, we know pretty reliably that it is very, very big. So even if there's something even bigger somewhere out there, this is relatively secure. It's maybe not the superlative, but it is a superlative in that sense. So it is sort of far out on those clouds from figure 2.
Property versus property plot, right?
Yeah. In a few cases, it was hard to find a single superlative because, in particular, some measurements aren't totally reliable. There's lots of searches for very low metallicity stars because they presumably formed shortly after the Big Bang and convey information on population 3. There's relatively few relatively little data on very high metallicity stars, even though those stars might be expected to have more planets, more materials to form planets. Or so in that example, we chose 14 Herculi. It is pretty much in every catalog we looked in, it is high metallicity. Sometimes you found we found stars that were much higher metallicity, but if you look at another catalog, they might be low metallicity. So generally, we look for things that were relatively reliable. And in the catalog, we also note this question of bias. Do we think that the objects listed in the sample actually are the most extreme things out there, or is that just the limit of our observations? So we just sort of provide our the true versus apparent superlative distinction. So we just sort of provide our take just from reading the literature on whether something is probably a true superlative or whether it might be superseded, perhaps even relatively soon.
Okay.
So the third sample is the anomaly sample, and there are many different ways something can be weird, which is basically the basic criterion for being an anomaly. It's something strange. And so we sort of provide this little classification system for different types of anomalies. Most objects are class 0 in that they aren't really anomalous. They're at least partially understood, at least on a basic level. And even if there are questions of classification, like Pluto, is it a planet or is it not? We know what Pluto is. It's just, that's really more of a social question in a way.
Right.
So it's sort of the first way something can be anomalous, this class 1 anomaly, is that you have an object that basically looks typical, but it's in the wrong place, or its kinematics are off. The hot Jupiters, for example, our original understanding, although it was quickly corrected, was that Jupiter-sized planets would be formed in the outer solar system and they would stay there. So when we discovered them right next to the star, well, that's anomalous until we understand them. And of course, as we do understand objects, they tend to not be anomalies anymore. But so this is sort of a bit dynamic. The second way something can be strange, the class 2s, those are objects that have a single quantitative property that is unusual, that sort of puts it on that plot of those clouds and clusters, that sort of pushes it off to the side or into a strange region of parameter space. So, for example, things that like millisecond pulsars, those were understood very quickly, but at least initially there was a time when, getting a neutron star to spin with a rotation period of about a couple of milliseconds, it wasn't really understood how that could happen. You can have a galaxy that sort of is infrared bright, and perhaps relative to the far infrared radio correlation. And various SETI researchers have used that as an example of something that might be artificial. Like the galaxy might otherwise look normal, but you have this strange quantity. The third is you can have an object that is qualitatively different. A historical example of that is actually Saturn. When Galileo pointed the telescope at Saturn, we know that it has rings, but he couldn't really make sense of what he was looking at. Was it a triple planet? Was it? There just wasn't anything. It's a planet, of course, but there was something qualitatively different from around it, about it than, say, Jupiter or Venus. So one example might be a star with a very narrow band radio emission. That's sort of the classic technosignature we're looking for. The fourth class is objects that we basically don't know what they even are. they just have no associates. They have no counterparts in other catalogs. And a lot of the discoveries of new phenomena in astronomy, they have originally been these sort of this class of unknown objects. Quasars, when we initially discovered them, didn't really know what they were. They just looked like stars, but they obviously weren't. They had these high redshifts. And what was that? Was that cosmological redshift, gravitational redshift? We didn't really know, and we didn't really understand how they could be so bright if they were at cosmological distances. On the other hand, because these are new types of objects, in a sense, discoveries of them are relatively rare. Usually when we've discovered a lot of types of objects, and we generally have been able to, so new discoveries are a bit rarer these days. And we sort of have this final speculative class 5. Those would be things that appear to actually defy the known laws of physics. The Anita neutrino experiment, for example, discovered these what appear to be upward going neutrinos out of the Antarctic ice, and it's looking for very high energy neutrinos, that so high energies that the Earth isn't transparent. So you have these particles just somehow coming out of the Earth, and that's an example of a class 5 anomaly. And those are extremely rare. We don't really have many of those in the catalog, but it's something that could be to basically keep our eyes out. And so most proposed technosignatures, they would be sort of class 2, 3, 4 in this scheme. Yeah. But we sort of present the scheme because maybe there are class 1 technosignatures that people can think of, or so on. So, we did a literature search, basically kept our eyes out for papers that said the mysterious, the enigmatic, the unexplained. And we did go through some astronomers' telegrams looking for objects that have unusual, where you basically had people requesting follow-up. Yep. One of the footnotes, you can see that there's this interesting Wikipedia page actually that says list of stars that dim oddly. So, we looked through those. It's kind of, and of course we followed up through.
You know what that is? Yes.
Yeah. So, and those sort of are the anomalies. And finally, there's this little control sample where you look for things that those were just a few things that were thought to be actual objects, whether normal objects like stars or strange anomalies, and that turned out to be either the observation themselves or even the objects themselves. They turned out to be in error, I guess you could say. Just a few of those. The main idea of the control sample, actually, probably the hope is that maybe we could actually observe what would be unphysical objects and analyze them as if they were actual objects. Like, you could, rather than tracking a single position on the sky, you could sort of pretend that objects rise in the west and set in the east, and track and sort of flip your tracking. So you, instead of actually tracking an object, you sort of move across the sky and you pretend that's a single object. And if you discover anything, that's a sign that something's wrong, because nothing could actually could actually
I got you.
Really do that.
Yep, I'm with you.
So that's sort of the ultimate test, because if we look at a, say, random point on the sky, well, maybe we just got really lucky or unlucky, however you decide to think of it, and that just happened to be the location that ETIs are located at.
Right.
But if you look at these unphysical sources, that would be a sort of a definitive test. And
Yes.
so so I think that brings us to the catalog itself,
Yay.
that map. So there are around 900 entries in the catalog, corresponding to 800 different objects. They're scattered all across the sky. In the north and south, we'll be using the Parkes Radio Telescope and Meerkat to observe objects in the south, Green Bank Telescope, and a few other facilities in the north. There are a few clusters in that map. There are a lot of things near the galactic center, 18 hours, 20-something south declination. You can kind of see the Virgo cluster, and so on. What this map doesn't show is that we also include a bunch of solar system objects. So those SETI really hasn't observed many solar system objects, but we hope to correct that. And if you, I think the next figure 4. Yeah, that. So this is sort of a plot of planetary objects that we'll be looking at. Some of them are extrasolar, but we also include all of the major planets and Pluto, whatever you're. We also include a bunch of asteroids. If you look at the y-axis, that's mass. So you have this sort of a whole bunch of asteroids that we'll be looking at to sort of cover this whole range of possible planetary bodies that we might host some more exotic type of life, or might have a probe or something on it, or around it. We also include a wide diversity of stars. I believe that's figure 5. Let
me slide to there. Ooh, yes.
Yeah, okay. I guess the left panel, figure 5, it doesn't really matter. But so those gray dots, those are our main catalog of stars that we've been using. The sort of the centerpieces that we've been of our breakthrough listen efforts, and all the big black dots, the blue dots, and the purple, and so on. Those are things in the Exotica catalog. So the previous catalog, it was already pretty broad, well sampled. It sampled a lot of the main sequence from B to M. We also include some red giants in there, but some of these more extreme objects, brown dwarfs on the lower right, white dwarfs on the lower left, supergiants, Wolf-Rayet stars, some unusual stellar types like our Corona Borealis type stars formed through exotic mechanisms like stellar mergers are in there, hot subdwarfs. So you sort of fill in a lot of this unexplored space in the color magnitude diagram and the HR diagram.
Cool.
Likewise, figure 6, it's not quite so clear, but we'll be sort of expanding the range of different types of galaxies we'll be looking at.
Okay.
We already included sort of elliptical, spiral, irregulars, but we include some extreme objects like extreme starburst, active galactic nuclei, some types of star clusters actually, including ones like that are kind of blur the lines between star clusters and galaxies, like some of these ultra compact dwarfs. We include things like the low surface brightness galaxy Malin 1, relatively large. It's big, but it's very faint, most of it. So
cool.
So basically, we increased the range and type and the different parameters we'll be looking at. And in some cases, we'll be looking at gravitationally lensed objects for some of these more extreme objects in the distant universe. But other than but we hope to sort of have this relatively complete sample. So the observing the catalog, I guess we're still sort of in the process of deciding how exactly we're going to observe it in detail. We've already started observing a few things. Most of these objects will probably, because we have a limited amount of time on the telescope, we'll probably be doing relatively short observations in one band in radio, for example, with one pointing. You can, and even though that's a relatively short, shallow observation, that's still more than anything that's been done in SETI before. But a few objects we might prioritize a bit more. We're hoping maybe we'll observe them with more depth. We'll have multiple bands, maybe even depending on hard disk space and other resources, we might provide raw voltages in radio for some of these, for a few of these. And I believe if you scroll down a bit to the next table,
random survey up.
So that's just sort of a straw man plan. Most of the objects will be low priority, and we'll do them when we have time. So one thing with these radio observations, we intend to look at the main catalog with that high frequency, but that's limited by weather, for example. So, if the weather's bad, we might look at these Exotica objects at low frequency instead. So, and
all right.
And also we'll be looking at, we have this catalog, of course, but there are occasional programs that observe a few rare types of objects in depth. Like we've done some dedicated observations to observe fast radio bursts, particularly one of the repeating fast radio bursts. We spend a lot of time with that one. So there is some flexibility in how we're going to approach this. Some specific targets that interest us, we might have dedicated programs to look at as time and interest is available. And so, but this paper does present this catalog for the public. In the appendices, really, we have we list, there are data tables in the appendices that sort of list the entire catalog. So most of that data is online because the catalog has hundreds and hundreds of entries. We have machine readable tables attached to the paper available at AppJ Supplement, and there are also supplementary materials online linked to in the paper explaining.
I think you have one of the catalog descriptors, right? So let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and do a screen share if you want to show the opening of that catalog descriptor.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So let's do that now.
You need to. Could you?
Yeah.
So this is sort of linked to in the paper. This is the full notes for the catalog.
Cool.
It provides sort of a description of each type of object, why we chose it, possible art alternates, and a few additional notes. So this is a few hundred pages actually, and this sort of provides justifications. And that link is in the paper. So, and we also have the tables for the catalog as well, linked to in the paper. So
very cool.
All that's
very cool.
Okay.
Brian, I want to thank you so much for walking us through your very lovely APJS article on one of everything.
Oh, thank you for hosting me. Yeah.
Let's see. So where might we head in the future? So this is catalog 1. Is this a living catalog? Will there be maybe a version 2 of this catalog, a version 3 of this catalog? Do you anticipate some of the upcoming telescopes can contribute? That'd be that VRO, JST. Are there theoretical calculations that can be done? Just sort of, where do we go with this over, let's say, the next 2 to 5 year timescale?
Well, first of all, our understanding of what is out there is changing. So we certainly hope to provide some updates on the catalog at some point as time is available. And maybe my hope is actually to provide an update this year sometime. I mean, most of the catalog will be relatively the same, but there will be some additions, some revisions, and so on. Longer term, we might have so this catalog is just sort of one of everything. And as I said, if you're observing one of everything, that's not much of anything specific. So maybe if in the future, if we have sort of the time, we might, and resources to observe many objects, we might provide sort of an expanded catalog with several of everything, so to sort of increase the chance of 10.
Very good.
Yeah. And yeah. And in fact, something a bit like that is actually how we'll be observing with Meerkat. Meerkat, we don't actually control where the telescope's looking at. What we do is we form these sort of beams within the field of view of the dishes. So you can generally target things within a few square degrees. So, and it's unlikely that you'll be looking at any particular object. So what we're thinking of doing is we might include sort of these semi-exotica.
Oh, there we go.
So yeah, basically you have a list. We'd be including sort of catalogs of say moderately sized catalogs of different types of objects. Like we might include a catalog of X-ray binaries, quasars, and to sort of add to the target list in addition to the million nearby stars that we'll be looking at. So you might observe a few thousand of those. Yeah. Although this is sort of the breakthrough listen catalog, we're hoping that it might be useful to others out there. As we saw, the prototype sample is described sort of as a treasury survey. Anyone who has a new instrument that they want to provide data for astronomers, we would be happy if they either use the catalog or used it as the basis for just covering all their bases, looking at a huge diversity of targets.
Cool.
And there's also an educational component. Not everyone, by listing sort of all these different types of objects in one place and by including references for all of them and links on ADS,
it's pretty
the students can, or even professionals can learn about these different types of objects and at least be aware that they exist. Like I've learned in the course of compiling the catalog, I personally have learned quite a bit about different types of things that are out there. And our hope is that those objects, that others will find that useful.
Well, for example, I didn't know until you mentioned it there in the paper that Otto Struve had speculated on hot Jupiters back in the 1950s. So
yeah.
So I'm going to go back and read that one.
Yeah, I think that's a relatively short paper, but yeah, it's
things like that, right? I mean, I think there's so many references in there, and it's a wonderful resource for exploration of the literature. So
yeah, that's what I hope so. Yeah,
very nice. Well, Brian, thank you so much once again
Oh.
for walking us through your lovely article and where
Thank you.
this project is headed. And that'll do, everyone. And I hope this made your astronomy day just a little bit better. And we'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.